Copa Club podcast, and we continue our Copa America previews. Of course, if we're going to talk about Argentinian football, I have to bring in Tom Robinson. Tom, it's been a while since I've had you on the podcast. Great to have you back.
Yeah, nice to be back on and speaking about South American football. And yeah, good to be back on with Argentina as world champions.
Absolutely. And look, we spoke about Brazil in episode 1. So if anyone missed that, go back to Apple, Spotify, YouTube. And they were definitely in a better mood than if we had recorded it before their preseason friendlies against England and Spain. But Argentina, they're going to be hard to knock off. 2 defeats in their last 54 matches, 9 wins across 2023, which includes 5 World Cup qualifiers. They're the favourites for a reason, Tom, aren't they?
Yeah, no, I mean, their record in the last couple of 2-3 years has been absolutely phenomenal. Under Scaloni, they've won everything that they could possibly win. So they're now at the top of the tree, and it's all about the next challenge of whether they can stay there. They've done some historic things, but you know, keeping up that motivation, keeping up that hunger and desire is a different task. So it's going to be really interesting to see how they fare.
Because that's what Scaloni spoke about a couple of months ago when there was a sheer panic that he might actually believe in the squad and they might have to get a new manager in. He's obviously staying for Copa America, but it was all about he said mentally it was taking a huge toll. Physically, it was taking a toll. It was reported in The Athletic that he actually got a stomach rash after the World Cup because of the amount of stress on him to keep Argentina going. And like you said, like they've only lost 2 in 54. But it's a completely different battle to keep them at the top. So yes, rightfully favourites for Copa America. But if the manager's saying that beforehand, there's so much at stake. Like there's the expectations there. Like Scaloni, for me, could walk away from this with his head held high if he was to potentially bow out the group stage. I'm not saying that will happen for what he's achieved, but he's just feeling that pressure constantly. And maybe that might be a slight weakness to their game heading into this tournament.
Yeah, potentially. I think, it's easy to overlook just how much pressure the Argentina manager faces. Same with Brazil, same with a lot of nations, to be honest. But you saw it pouring out of him at the World Cup final, that moment of realization, and I think it just shows you the immense stress that, let's be honest, he's still a rookie manager. He's achieved so much in his career already, but this is still early in his career, so it's understandable that even the most experienced managers might be feeling it. So I think it's taken its toll. I think you can definitely look at the things that he's been saying about his future and putting it on that. He is contracted until 2026, at the end of the World Cup cycle. Whether he goes or not is the big question. Is that going to be a destabilizing effect on the team, or could it be extra fuel to be like, you know what, let's perform at our highest to make sure that he stays, because obviously the players are right behind him, the public's right behind him. You said there that if he went out the group stage, he could still leave with his head held high. I think that is definitely the case. But you could also say, is this, is it worth going out when you're still on top, knowing that you're going to be a legend forever? You could come back to the national team whenever you want in the future. There's probably an element of that, of keeping his options open. Bit of a power play with Chiqui Tapia and AFA as well. It's not always been the rosiest of relationships, even perhaps behind the scenes. Let's not forget that he was kind of chosen because the AFA were broke and couldn't really afford to go out and get a high level manager. So I think there's been issues there bubbling under the surface. So I think as much as, he's kind of in the best of both worlds, he could see out the rest of his contract if things keep going well. But it also gives him that little bit of flexibility to maybe walk away when he wants, having kind of flagged it early, saying, yeah, I'm not sure how much longer I can go on this, and almost just play it by ear as things go along. So, I'm sure it's not quite as cynical as that, but you've got to focus on that, and maybe the idea of having a Messi-less Argentina in the future doesn't necessarily mean that he's quite wanting to commit to that long-term future, even if he has put pen to paper.
I completely agree with that, and definitely understand his point of view. If he was to bow out, he would never say that, but it would make perfect sense. But away from politics, off the pitch, let's talk a little bit about Argentina on the pitch, especially during those World Cup qualifiers. Because if you look on paper, obviously 5 wins to 0 within that looks really strong. And maybe I'm coming across really harsh at the start of this podcast on the favourites and slamming them a little bit. But if we dive a little bit deeper into that, very narrow victories across those. And Argentina, if you look even across their last 30, 40 games, they hardly ever blow teams away. They're always quite professional results, which you would take because they've had plenty of success. But a 1-0 victory over Ecuador with a bit of Messi magic with his free kick, and then relying on Otamendi for that 1-0 victory against Paraguay. And yes, he was the goal scorer again against Brazil, which was a famous victory. So I'm not going to criticise anyone for that. But a couple of narrow victories at home, obviously leaning towards Messi or set pieces, when there's so much talent across that squad. Is that a little bit worrying in terms of coming into a tournament like this? Or do you feel like that suits them perfectly in terms of they know how to get a goal and shut up shop?
Yeah, I don't think it is a massive cause for concern. You've got to remember that the World Cup qualifiers is a marathon and not a sprint when it comes to South American qualifiers. It's almost impossible that they're not going to qualify. So if you're not hitting your stride right at the start, there's no shame in that. You don't want to kind of go, peak too early and then suffer for the tournament. The year after the World Cup is famously a bit of not a nothing year, but it's a case of trying new things, getting the results, putting yourself in a good position. I mean, now that there's more places available to go to the World Cup, there's even less of a chance of Argentina not making it. Getting 5 wins out of 6, only 2 goals conceded. I think there's plenty of positives to take there. And, even if the likes of Ecuador and Peru, Paraguay aren't at the same level, they're still tough fixtures. There's no easy games in South American qualifying. And the fact that Brazil haven't been quite on it as well probably just takes that pressure off a little bit. So, yeah, there's some areas that they can improve on. But I think it's more a case of, just giving them little wake-up calls rather than massive cause for concern. I mean, top of the qualifiers, 1 loss against Uruguay there, but I think they're going to go into this Copa America one of the favourites, if not the favourite. Anything can obviously happen, but semi-finals is kind of a minimum for this Argentina team.
You've touched upon that Uruguay game, so we'll focus on that for now because that was alongside that famous Saudi Arabia game in the World Cup. We won't touch upon that, but the Uruguay was only their second defeat in 54 games. It was in Buenos Aires. It wasn't at El Monumental because I believe that was when Taylor Swift had a concert on, so it was famously moved to La Bombonera. But they lost 2-0 to Uruguay, and there's been a few question marks around Argentina's defence. Yes, they've kept some clean sheets, but I think people are looking at it on the surface. Otamendi, 36, potentially if he's a weak link. But I went back and watched that Uruguay game today, and in between the right back and the centre back, they were carved open a few times. There was a few early signs. Darwin Núñez missed a couple of opportunities, and it could have been 3 or 4 in the end, really, if he'd taken them. But what was your take on that particular game, Tom? Because it was a little bit concerning that Argentina struggled, really. And of all people, Messi was the one who gave the ball away for that second goal. And Uruguay showed how dangerous they were on the counter. And that wasn't for the first time during qualifiers either.
Yeah, no, it's definitely a big wake-up call. Again, I think, as well as they've done defensively and how impressive they've managed to turn things around in that area of the pitch, like you said, Otamendi is not a long-term solution. A lot of us have been surprised that he's managed to stay in the team this long, but he was, very good. Bar a little spell of the final in that win there. So you've got to give him some credit for that, and I think his personality off the pitch and leadership on it does definitely help. But you feel like in this cycle, he's going to be phased out by the next World Cup cycle. So this is probably a last hurrah for him, maybe a chance to try some new people alongside Cuti Romero, who's had a huge impact on that defence. I do think the fullbacks are Argentina's weakest area, and something that I'm sure we'll talk about. But there's areas that you can get at this Argentina team. They're not a perfect side that is going to completely dominate from start to finish. You will get chances against them, and Uruguay showed that with the pace, physicality, dynamism they have, especially in the middle of the park, and against that defensive line. So I think, it's a useful loss, if that's such a thing, for this Argentina team. But I think more, the takeaways that I was getting from that game was way more, from a positive side from Uruguay, rather than, wait a minute, we're going to need to rip up the script here for Argentina and have a big existential crisis. I think it was way more like, okay, everyone's sitting up and taking notice of Bielsa's Uruguay. They're going to be a real strong contender at the Copa America, and also in this World Cup qualifiers. You can easily see them topping the whole thing. The manager they've got, the squad, the kind of age profile of that squad, the young players coming through, the clubs they're playing at. I think it was way more that double header of them getting results against Argentina and Brazil is way more the positive ticks in the Uruguay account, rather than anything major to worry about for Argentina.
Yeah, and look, that was obviously it was Brazil's worst year in their history, I believe, and Brazil didn't even have a shot on target when they faced Uruguay. So I think it goes to show, like, during that period, because there was definitely a lot of question marks around Bielsa when he first came into Uruguay in terms of, like, can he keep clean sheets? And he hadn't until that double header, like you said, and then they really proved the point. So probably the main competitors to Argentina, would you say? Because Brazil were a little bit of an unknown quantity now, aren't they? Because if you were to face them with Denise in charge, you'd be confident of beating them again, especially out of Brazil, which was so impressive when you did that at the Maracana. But with Brazil now obviously bringing in Darval Jr., they were impressed against England. It wasn't obviously their full strength side, plenty of injuries. But if, say, Argentina were to get to the final, I'm just going to throw this one at you, and it was off the cuff, but if Argentina were to get to the final, who would you fancy more out of Brazil and Uruguay, taking away obviously everything and looking at their 11 on the pitch? Who would you rather face at the moment?
I mean, purely for the 11 on the pitch, it's almost a 50-50 between those two teams, because I think the likes of Valverde, Bentancur in the middle of the park for Uruguay, Nunez obviously has got that chaos factor to him. Some really good defensive players there for Uruguay as well. Maybe they've got players, a better balance. They're a little bit further on in their development, but Brazil's Brazil, and even if they're not right at it, they've got the quality and depth of talent that they'd still be the one you'd fear more out of the two. I think there's still that psychological advantage over Uruguay that Argentina would probably have historically. Whereas, Brazil, okay, this is not a Brazil in its final form. It's still working out a new midfield. But, even if they've not got a lot of international experience, the likes of Bruno Guimaraes, Douglas Luiz, Paquetá, a bit more experience, that is a potentially excellent midfield for Brazil. Vinicius Jr., one of the best players in the world, and his pace could really hurt Argentina. Same with Rodrigo, and obviously if Neymar's around as well, he's still an important figure for them. Defensively, you can get at Brazil more, and there isn't that strength of depth, particularly at fullback. You don't have to worry about fullbacks bombing on quite as much as you did in the past. But I think, ask any Argentinian and they'd probably take a Uruguay over a Brazil in the final. Even if they would back themselves to beat absolutely anyone at the moment, confidence is high. Things can massively yo-yo between despair and jubilation when it comes to Argentina. But when they're confident, when they're winning, they'll fancy themselves to beat anyone. So they'll go into this tournament as favourites, but anything can happen in these competitions, and Brazil and Uruguay are definitely the two teams to fear the most. And on their day, in a one-off game, neutral ground, who knows what can happen.
Yeah, exactly. And you spoke about obviously the power they have on the channels, Brazil in particular, Vinicius Junior, Rodrigo, and you mentioned obviously Argentina's Achilles heel is the fullbacks at the moment. So I wanted to pitch to you who would be your starting fullbacks in the Copa America, or who would you fill you with confidence, because Scaloni's changed and chopped throughout the qualifiers as to who he's actually bringing in those positions. So who would be the most reliable ones for you if everyone is fit?
So I think at right back, I'd say Molina's probably got the edge now, playing at a high level with Atletico Madrid. Montiel's always going to be a great option to have in the squad because, his penalty taking just, on its own is worth its weight in gold. Even though he's, not had a great time at the club level, I think he's an important player within the squad. So, I think the right-hand side, for the time being at least, even though I wouldn't say Molina's a world beater. He's shown that he's got some great strengths, and he's sort of coming on as a good option there for the sort of mid to long term. Left back is the big worry, I think. Not so much for this tournament, but going forward. Tagliafico and Acuna, both solid, reliable. 6, 7 out of 10s. Both can be got at, but I think both are. You're not too worried if either of them are playing. You know their strengths, you know their limitations. I think it's more going to be interesting at what stage Argentina start to think, okay, these guys aren't going to be probably around at the next World Cup, or if they are, maybe just one of them as an experienced backup. We need to start giving some experience to a young player, and there aren't too many good left backs in Argentina in their prime at the moment, in that kind of 25 to 27 age bracket. So you're looking possibly younger than that. Valentin Barco being the obvious standout, but with that move to Brighton, he's still finding his feet. He's not getting his game time just yet. This tournament probably comes a little bit too soon to throw him in, although he's shown with his performances at Boca that he's more than capable of seizing those really, high pressure moments and almost reveling in it. So I wouldn't be worried if Barco came in. I just think, he's probably the guy you start relying on once the Copa America is over. You could maybe have a look at, some other options like Esquivel or, maybe even Blanco. But they're not guys who I feel are going to take the national team on in the long term. Barco's the one great hope. And who knows if he'll even end up playing left back. I think he, in a dominant side like Argentina, he could play in that role. But again, he's shown defensive frailties as well. So it's an area that you're really begging for some good options to come through. Other than that, you could maybe fudge it by having a left-sided centre back who can play in a more reserved role and kind of have a lopsided back four with Molina really pushing on and look at it that way. So that's a big area of not of concern, but the area that interests me most in terms of where Argentina need to start experimenting. But the Copa's probably not a place to experiment too much.
No, definitely not. And not, you answered the question for me, which I was going to propose to you in terms of Valentin Barco, because the reason probably why he sealed that move to Brighton, in my opinion, was because he excelled in the midfield role. The more advanced he got, the better we saw him, and the more he sort of thrived into games. And as you said, defensively, a little bit all over the place at times because he's more interested in bombing forward. So it depends exactly, well, who's in charge, I guess, and who takes over potentially after Copa America and what the plan is. So it'd be really interesting to see what happens with Barco. Hopefully he gets a bit more game time with Brighton and he settles in. It'd be interesting to see exactly where they play him as well, because if he fits in at left back and develops there, then your answer's right there. But at the moment, it's not something I quite see. But then I don't see him fitting into the midfield position at the moment, because obviously, as we'll get onto it now, actually, it makes perfect sense. It's such a star-studded squad in between, well, all over the pitch, really. Away, I know we spoke about so many defensive areas, but the midfield and forward area is a joy to watch, and there's almost too many to name, really. But I'll hand over the microphone to you because I'm interested to see if, look, I'm going to put you in charge of day one against Canada. That midfield three, who would you be relying on to sort of carry you through the tournament? Who would you like to see sort of add that little bit of quality in the midfield, which is going to put Argentina's name back on that trophy?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's one thing who you line up against Canada to who you line up against a more formidable opponent. So it might be, I think there's probably the likelihood that in an ideal world, you're lining up with Enzo, Alexis, and De Paul. That's probably the first choice midfield these days. It is kind of assembled mid-flight during the World Cup, which I think is to Scaloni's great credit that he kind of had to rip up his preferred midfield three of Lo Celso, Paredes, and De Paul, and parachute these guys in, and they did phenomenally, and they've kind of gone on to good things. Alexis, I think, is going to be a really, really important figure because he's stepped up to Liverpool. He's been a key player for them. He can kind of do a little bit of everything in midfield as well, and he's so good both in and out of possession that I think he's going to be a real tempo setter. Obviously, De Paul is kind of the emotional leader in that midfield, and he provides a lot of energy and always comes up with the goods when it comes to Argentina as well. So, I think he's still going to be an important figure, but McAllister's kind of risen to being probably the midfielder who's playing at the highest level in the modern game right now. Enzo's not had a great time at Chelsea, and it's going to be interesting to see what he does in this tournament because, the price tag, the World Cup, everything that he's done up until his move to Chelsea means that you kind of think it's a given that he's going to be in that midfield. But I don't think he should be resting on his laurels because, there are other good midfielders. Ezequiel Palacios is just coming off a great season with Bayer Leverkusen. I really wonder if there's a place for him in that midfield because he's someone who maybe fits more into a McAllister, De Paul kind of role rather than an Enzo role. But I think, that Scaloni, as I said, he's shown that he's not afraid to mix it up and try different options. And the good thing is they do have so many options there. So whether you're playing Paredes, Lo Celso, Palacios, or the three that are sort of there, you can be rest assured that they're all going to come in and do a good job, and they're all good technicians. They can all mix it up and get stuck in, perhaps sometimes a bit too much when you look at Paredes' head losses occasionally. But I think that's going to be an area that is going to be interesting, but isn't an area of concern really because there's so much strength and depth there. I just think that it could be a real statement, sort of almost handing over the baton to Alexis as the boss of the midfield this tournament, which is incredible really to say because as much as he was a promising player coming through, I don't think many of us saw him getting quite to this level, and certainly not, as it kind of midfield, multifaceted midfielder, especially when he was coming through at Argentinos and his performances at Boca as well. You kind of thought he'd be more in the attacking third, which obviously he can do. But it's been really interesting to see how he's developed as a midfielder, and I think he's increasingly becoming a big player for Argentina.
Yeah, I have to agree again. And I actually went back and before we jumped on this podcast last week, I went back and watched the Brazil 1-0 victory and remember watching that live, and it was just so scrappy and I didn't really have too much to take away from it at the time, but I tried to dissect it a little bit further. And you've said everything I wanted to say in terms of McAllister. If you actually go back and watch that game, he's the one who's actually sort of standing out and amongst all 22 players. Yes, Brazil had a few chances and they probably should have got something out of the game, but he was the one sort of dictating the play in the middle. He was calm in possession. He was the one finding pockets of space in that final third, which is so important. And like you said, for McAllister to be the one doing that with all these star-studded names, you would never have expected it. And it surprised me when I went back and watched that Brazil game as to how good he was, and he was the standout player. So look, this really could be the tournament where he could walk away with the player of the tournament sort of trophy. And you think about it 2 or 3 years ago, you never would have said that. So one to really watch, and he was really impressive in that Brazil game. Definitely go back and watch the highlights, not just for the chaos at the start. Actually focus on the pitch, and he was definitely one of the standout players. So arguably he could be one of the first names on the team sheet, aside from Lionel Messi, of course. Is there anyone else you wanted to give a mention for in terms of in the starting 11? I know we focus on the defence midfield, but let's talk about that attacking area, because there's a fair few opportunities. I know obviously Messi will be the first name on the team sheet alongside McAllister, but obviously there's that forward space up for grabs in terms of, is it going to be Julian Alvarez or is it going to be Lautaro Martinez? There's choices there for Scaloni.
Yeah, there's definite choices there. I mean, Alvarez obviously come in and done amazing things, and at the start of the season, you'd be a shoe-in to be the starter with the way he was playing for City. Gone off the boil a little bit, and Lautaro has been traditionally the main man for Scaloni. He's had a great season at Inter, pretty much ever since that World Cup. He's found his shooting boots again. So I think whoever you play, or even if you play a combination of them both, you've got a willing runner who's going to put pressure on up front, who's going to help out Messi, and more often than not is hopefully going to be clinical. Not always a guarantee, but they're both two excellent strikers who I think you can hang your hat on. I think for me, the attacking player that I think could potentially be one of the more interesting stories, maybe a bit of a breakthrough tournament, would be Garnacho. I think he's really come on this season. He's not had loads of he's had a good amount of first team football now. I think it's about 9 goals, 6 assists in all competitions. So, to get into double figures, goals and assists, especially in quite a chaotic club setup, still question marks over his mentality and things like that. But I think everyone knows about him in Argentina, but you wonder whether this might be the tournament that really sort of stamps his name on, the wider public, and see if he can be that kind of long-term heir to Di Maria. So I don't think he's necessarily going to start, but I think he'll be playing a sort of more decisive role than he has done in the past. And of the young players to sort of come through, he feels like, the most likely to make an impression.
Speaking of young players, there's so much talent if we go further down the food chain, so to speak, when it comes to Argentinian young talent. And we saw that with the qualifiers, with the recent under-23 qualifiers on the way to Paris. Now, I'm just going to throw a few names at you here, because we could be here for the next 5 minutes, really, with the amount of talent coming through. But Federico Redondo, Fernandez and Medina from Boca, and of course, Claudio Echeverri. Would there be any you'd include for this Copa America, just to give them that experience?
I'd be surprised if any of them made the squad list for this one. I think on one hand, you're thinking, well, are they just going to really kind of separate under 23s and senior, and sort of say, okay, this summer you've got the Olympics, we want you fit and firing for that, and kind of just ease them into the setup. I think the fact that none of them have really had much of a role in sort of senior call up before then, you'd be surprised. I mean, Echeverri could be that outside one, but to be honest, I think if you're looking at anyone from the under 23 squad, the most obvious ones who could potentially play at both would be Thiago Almada, obviously captain for the under 23s, and part of the World Cup winning squad, someone who's been pretty ingrained and embedded into that setup, and I think would 100% be in the squad if it wasn't for the Olympics. That's the only reason that he might not be in there. And then other than that, I think the players who from that under 23s who you'd be looking at maybe making an impact would be Alan Varela, who's obviously done very well in Porto, and Matthias Sule, who's been one of the breakthrough stars in Serie A in a relegation threatened team as well. I feel like they're the ones who are playing week in, week out for top level clubs who could have a shout and have been in and around the squad. But realistically, I think there's a feeling that, you know what, let's leave that for the under-23s. I think the young players that you're going to be looking at, as we said, are kind of Garnacho, Enzo, if you still count him as a young player, still in that under-23 bracket. Barco we mentioned as well, who could play both. I think he's probably the one of them. And then other than that, Buonanotte, who's again feels like someone who's more been earmarked as part of that senior setup rather than someone who's going to contribute to the under-23s. And I've been impressed with him in flashes this season. It feels like he's getting into the rhythm of the Premier League more. Certainly the start of the year, he was chipping in with some goals, and it feels like he's sort of, physically and intensity-wise, he's there. So I think if you're looking at young players, they're probably the ones. But I mean, I love Almada, so I would like to see him at both, but I could understand why he maybe sits this one out.
Yeah, he was next on my list, but I just wanted to see if you naturally said him, and I knew you would. I think people who follow you in socials know how much of a fan you are of him and Echeverri, which is why I sort of threw those names at you there just to see if they could be a potential wild card. Not quite a Theo Walcott wild card, but I think if it wasn't for that Olympics, we may have seen one or two squeezed in just for the experience, really. But one for 2026. All of this has been great, Tom. Really appreciate you coming on. I'm just going to throw a couple of quick questions at you just to sign off the podcast. Martinez or Alvarez, if you had to choose one to lead the line?
It's a tricky one. I think I would probably still go Alvarez to begin with, just because of the pressing and the off the ball work that he does. I think that just frees Messi up so much more. But honestly, flip of the coin, really, I'd have no problems with either starting. So yeah, maybe just Alvarez, just because of the kind of success he's had with the national team more recently, even if Lautaro is maybe in slightly better club form.
Does Messi win the Golden Boot?
I'm not sure he wins the Golden Boot, but maybe he signs off with a win for Argentina, though. That'd be nice.
That was my next question. Argentina, yes, they're the favourites, and obviously this is an Argentinian podcast. There may be a theme throughout these previews as we do different nations, but do you think they will be winning it come the end of the summer?
I mean, I hope so. I'm not going to jinx them, but I'll just say that I hope so. I think it would be pretty incredible, but they're in that glorious position of, if they don't win it, then it's probably the one time that they could probably not be as gutted about it, although I'm sure emotions will run high regardless. But yeah, I'd always want to see them win it, so fingers crossed. But obviously very hard to do the repeat, and just even though if those 1% across the board drop off, then that can sometimes be enough. So I think the fact that they're comfortably the favourites just says how much they've progressed in even the last 4 years, let alone the last 6 years. Because going into last edition of the Copa America, yes, you fancied them to be able to challenge, but I think I would have been happy with the semi-final last time. Now it should be final minimum. But again, we'll see. We'll be watching closely and hopefully no horrendous Saudi Arabia-esque performances happen again.
That's what the Uruguay game was for. It was just that little warning.
Yeah, get it out of your system.
Absolutely. The last question I want to ask you is, we spoke about Uruguay, so this may be the answer for you, but any particular dark horses which have caught your eye away from Argentina and potentially Brazil? Yeah,
I mean, as you said, the obvious one is Uruguay. I do like what Ecuador are doing. They're just really heavily invested in youth development, and you're starting to see the fruits of that come through. I still think they're a little bit far away from really being able to challenge. Probably need a sort of more reliable goal scorer. But I also think that Colombia might show an improved performance as well. So definitely lots of teams that can really hurt you, and even less fancy teams. Pretty much all of them have got a little touch of magic in there that can throw a spanner in the works. So yeah, it's always a great competition, and yeah, I'll be watching it religiously.
Yes, as will all of us, and hopefully will our listeners will as well. But look, Tom, thank you for coming on. You can watch this on YouTube. Join us on Apple and Spotify. We'll be going through all the other nations with different guests, so keep an eye on that in the build up to the tournament. But once again, Tom, thank you very much for your insight.
No, my pleasure, and enjoy your time in South America.
Oh, I will. Thank you very much.